Once upon a time, there was this prince that wanted to save his people. He made one too many choices that blurred the line between good and evil.
This entire city must be purged.
And now he killed his people. And a lot of other people as well. It was a whole mess. Years later, the character was butchered in Shadowlands. This video is a very subjective piece on a chapter in the history of Warcraft that I have been mulling over for a long time. Let's just rip this band-aid. Arthas is a story about a flawed character whose righteous morals pushed him more and more into a fanatical ideology, eventually becoming that which he had been hunting down. And Shadowlands pulled down its pants and took one last runny dump on him in the hopes of cheesily grabbing at the player's heartstrings for one last time. Who was Arthas? If you haven't read the book Arthas, Rise of the Lich King, I wholeheartedly recommend it, as it is one of the best books on the lore of Warcraft and World of Warcraft. It's an almost perfect example on how to write a character in a video game where storytelling is limited in a lot of ways, but could be expanded upon in an actual book without making the player feel like they have to read the book to understand. You don't have to read it to understand the character, you could read it, however, to learn about the depths of his character. Without actually turning this into an abridged audiobook, long story short, Arthas was the Prince of Lordaeron, trained under Muradin for martial combat and under Uther for the teachings of the light, making him a bona fide paladin. He harbored a love and pride for his people and his kingdom as well, and wanted nothing more than to protect them. He fell in love with Jaina Proudmoore and was even about to be betrothed, but Arthas called it off despite being the one to ask Jaina in marriage. They eventually went their separate ways in their respective training and callings and came together on the mission to stop the mysterious plague years later. If you played the Warcraft 3 human campaign, you will know the big parts of this story. If you haven't, you should. On this journey, you follow Arthas and see how his actions become more and more futile. Despite his sacrifices, he seems to be constantly losing the battle against the plague and the scourge, as he would later find. And this can be one of the first turning points that are at least obvious to the player. Stratholme is under attack by the plague and its citizens have been already infected. Noticing as how the infected would quickly turn into the undead throughout his campaign, that is, Arthas decided that he has to kill everyone. This is a very controversial choice he makes, and for obvious reasons is not really supported by neither Jaina, his former lover and current friend, and Uther, his mentor and potential father figure. And really, how much you can blame him? We as a player know there is nothing he can do. What can he do? There is no cure for the plague and clearly not enough time to figure one out. Killing his people could be an act of mercy, although a very fanatical one at that. And maybe that is the biggest and only counter-argument to Arthas' action. The alternative would be to not purge Stratholme, which by the time any serious action could be taken to combat Mal'Ganis' plan, the entire population would be a zombie army that needs to be put down anyway. So we could argue the morality of the choice. On one hand, he kills his living people, on the other he kills their tortured spirits that inhabit an undead body. While the first choice is a morality question that brings to the table the aspect of humanity, or lack thereof, in taking the life of innocent people, the second choice is inaction in the face of adversity and waiting for time to provide a much more morally safe choice to make. Kill the undead instead of actual living people. Arthas chose the former. Instead of waiting for fate to choose for him, he walked the difficult path, opting to carry a heavier load on his shoulders for the rest of his life. And here we can debate Arthas' character. If he was a morally right person, he would have made an impossible choice, one that would preserve as much of the humanity of his citizens as possible. The other choice would be to sacrifice that humanity to what we now know is a fate worse than death, and that is to become a part of the scourge. If his character was doomed to a lack of empathy towards humanity, aka he was evil all along, pushing him to make the easier choice from a military standpoint, killing civilians is easier than killing rage-filled undead zombies, then we would have had a totally different character. This duality of his personality made him interesting and relatable. He was flawed and constantly pushed to the edge of his sanity, seeing his people die left and right and losing every major battle against the Scourge, at least underneath the surface. And this was more impactful to him since he also had a sense of royal pride. He had to defend his people because he was the future king, and constantly losing the battles made him resent his opponent even more, evident with his line at the end of the Stratholme mission saying he will chase Mal'Ganis to the ends of the earth, and not really talking about the atrocious act he committed and essentially finding vengeance or justice for his people, but more so enacting his own self-righteous view of vengeance.
I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth if I have to. Do you hear me? To the ends of the earth!
This stopped being a battle to save his people and became a battle to seek revenge with the guise of righteous retribution. Arthas' descent into darkness was gradual and inexorable, and most of all tragic. His descent was seemingly aided by his pride and desire to win, which overshadowed his need to protect his people. The attributes that influenced his path in the end, to become a Death Knight, are attributes that all of us have. All of us have pride, and all of us are frustrated when we keep losing. You could say there was also the manipulation of the Lich King whispering in his ear and arguably driving him mad. But these actions, one would argue, could only have been possible if his righteous spirit was already shaken. Everything stands to point out how we could have easily followed the same path as him, since in the end we were already plagued with humanity. This is also a part of why Arthas was such a beloved character, because he is relatable above all else, which can hardly be said about most characters in WoW today. His second chapter of the story, with him being a Death Knight, is less relatable, but the purpose of it is to get us to dislike him even more as a character. The amazing part of his depraved persona is made so because of the existing contrast with who he was as a prince and a paladin. Without the initial version of Arthas, we wouldn't have been made to care as much about him, and we could probably fast forward to the fall of the Lich King. Although we could easily talk endlessly about his campaign as a Death Knight and ascension as a Lich King. He never really changed much during that process. Once again, reading the Arthas book, by the end he has an internal conflict with himself. He is together with Ner'zhul, the actual Lich King that supposedly corrupted him and controlled his mind, something some people would love to believe in the hopes of preserving their pristine image of the tragic prince. The other person there is Arthas as a youth, to represent his innocence, naivety, and purity. And the last one is himself, Arthas, the Death Knight, the former paladin, the new Lich King. In that situation, he ends up destroying both Ner'zhul and his youth, completing the process of him being the Lich King. This is really cool for a few reasons. First of all, it dispels the notion of Ner'zhul being the one to control him, giving Arthas more agency over his actions, if not full agency, and instead becoming more likable as a bad guy and detestable as a character. Both good qualities to have for a villain in the story. The second reason as to why this is cool is because it sets up Arthas to actually be pure evil by destroying both his young self and Ner'zhul. Killing his innocence makes us completely give up on a potential redemption story for him. This is refreshing for a villain because sometimes it's just nice to wish for a bad guy to lose and pay for his crimes. Sometimes we as players, viewers, and readers want to see justice enacted. Killing Ner'zhul gives us the perfect autonomous character full in control over his actions. And following Warcraft 3 and leading up to the Wrath of the Lich King, we can clearly assume that all of his decisions are coming from him and him alone, however warped and malevolent they are. And if we will be completely honest with ourselves, we kind of want to see the tragedy. There is a weird fascination with people when it comes to tragedy and things of that nature. Maybe it's the same reason as to why we like to watch horror movies and we get engrossed in news reports talking about some horrible stuff happening to other people. Not that we are inherently evil ourselves, but seeing it manifest trains our brain on how to potentially avoid it in our own lives. It's a defense mechanism tied to our survival as an animal on this planet, so it goes deeper into ourselves as a human. So this whole thing is way more complex than it would seem, and the end of Arthas when he is in his father's arms is one of the most tragic scenes in a video game. We see Arthas lose, we see his father confirming it, we see Arthas having no remorse and his father having no pity. This signifies that Arthas is indeed a lost soul, lost to darkness and other manifestations of it, never able to find redemption and forever doomed to suffer the consequences of his actions. This signifies his father has completely forsaken his wayward son and accepted the path he chose, one that threw away his humanity and the love for his people. They both accepted it. Arthas, that his time has come and the situation was entirely justified, and his father acknowledging indirectly that his son had to face the punishment for his crimes. And thus Arthas' eyes close, and his soul leaves the world behind. This was a perfect ending to an imperfect character written closely to perfection. It was a good story, one that far exceeds the limitation of what the game has offered us until now. One that has presented us with closure to the story and reason most of us fell in love with Warcraft and decided to play the game or even keep playing long after. There is a short story following the end of Wrath describing Sylvanas' experience after she threw herself off of Icecrown in regards to the hell she was in, which was supposedly Shadowlands at the time. And of course, now that we have actually experienced Shadowlands, we know that what Sylvanas experienced was the Maw based on what we know now. At the time, the description was a lot more sinister and vague. Figures clawing at her body, eyes piercing her while she couldn't look back, scream, or run away. There she met Arthas as well, or at least encountered the infantile version of Arthas, for which she might even have felt pity. Shadowlands in the original story of Arthas, however little it was mentioned at the time, was a much different place than what Shadowlands is now for us. And this stands at the basis of the story writer's proclivity of retconning lore time and time again. And you may like or dislike it, but when it comes to a character as beloved as Arthas, the waters have to be treaded so lightly that if a misstep happens, it will lead to a massive ripple, which is what happened at the end of 9.2. The raid, that is. Arthas' soul was used in the Mournblade that controlled Anduin. This is a weird thing to do to a character that already had its closure. Why was this necessary? The Jailer was an eternal one, the most powerful being in the Shadowlands with the most powerful control over death. What could the soul of one Death Knight that used his Helm of Domination provide him with that he couldn't inherently use to take over the soul of a mortal boy king? And this is not to go deeper into the world building issues that Shadowland has, maybe in a different video. The Jailer should not need to use the soul of Arthas to control Anduin, when the Jailer created the Helm of Domination that apparently controlled Arthas in the first place. Wait, so Arthas was controlled by the Jailer in the end? So Arthas didn't have autonomy over his actions? So Arthas wasn't in full control as a Lich King, the way the books confirmed it and the way Wrath of the Lich King kind of implied it? So what? Were his actions then excusable? This brings in so much mess into the character that doesn't need to be there, because it's hard to see how the writers didn't just use Arthas as a crutch to bring emotional value into what was otherwise a very subpar story. Arthas was used as a story crush to appeal to people's nostalgia and love for the game. It didn't make sense for the story since it would contradict parts of the character of Zovaal that the writers took their sweet time to build. This master six-dimensional chess strategist that was behind every major event in Warcraft needed the soul of Arthas as a conduit? So he planned the entire history of Azeroth. But if Arthas never existed, or a similar faller prince/paladin never existed, he could never have had the power to control Anduin? Really now? The concept is starting to fall on its ass, and as a side effect of that, the writers took a runny, steamy dump on the best character the game had written, supposedly, just to bring some more hype in the game from players that gave up on it for legitimate reasons. Arthas was literally a sacrifice to bring back some love into the game, and in the end, reduced to a little summer fly that just extinguished itself. Wait, so the Jailer used him and controlled him and invalidated almost all of our feelings for the character because the writers deemed it so, more than a decade after Arthas' story ended, and not only did he not pay for what we thought to be his evil actions, Arthas that is, but his evil actions are questionable now, and he isn't getting justice because he just disappeared. He was just a battery that was thrown out as used toilet paper to fuel and explain a very poorly constructed story about death. Obviously, this contradicts the version of Arthas that was exposed to us for years and retconned in the end so that the Shadowlands story would make sense. Similar to how the Nathrezim were retconned and how Shadowlands was retconned from the realm of death where Loa's and troll ancestor spirits lay to this. Not sure how many people enjoyed the 6D chess mastermind jailer being behind the Burning Legion. Definitely don't think the majority enjoyed him being behind the Lich King, but then they brought back Arthas one more time to act as a Duracell battery. Arthas' overall story is about the hero that loses in the end. His fight to enact good in the world is met with battle after battle where he thinks he is gaining ground, but is actually losing it. And in its defeat, he succumbs to the darkness and ascends as the Lich King. He gains sovereignty over his thoughts, actions, and life and commits atrocious acts. He is defeated and sentenced to pay for his crimes. He tragically ends and we are left with a bittersweet taste in our mouths. But overall, knew his story ended and it was an amazing and worthy end. And then Shadowlands came and said, nope. I'm not sure if there's a way to save the character from the literary death it suffered insofar as the story team believes Arthas needs saving. But this trend that we keep seeing in the media with the new age thinking of adapting or retconning older concepts to fit a more modern theme seems to be hurting the game more than helping it. Thank you for watching the video so far, and thank you patrons for supporting the content. Obviously, this is a new style of video that we haven't done, that we've been waiting to do for years, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Clearly, it's filled with biases and subjectiveness, but hey, we all have our opinions, and who knows, maybe you agree or don't agree, and you can definitely let us know in the comment section down below. If you want to support our content and see more of this in the future, consider becoming a Patreon with the link in the description. See you next time!
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.